A presidential directive was issued to America's largest retailer, Walmart. Eat the cost of rising tariffs, they were told, in order to protect consumers. The result, however, is not protection. It is a quiet, systemic fracturing. Hundreds of stores are not just becoming more expensive. They are beginning to disappear from the very communities that rely on them most. This forces a critical question, one with echoes for any nation's long-term planning. What happens when the anchor of affordability simply vanishes? This analysis connects those dots, tracing the invisible line from a single trade policy to the surprising fragility of a retail giant. To see that line clearly, however, you first have to understand the specific, hidden assumption at the heart of Walmart's entire business model, an assumption that has just been broken. To understand why this is happening, we need to look under the hood at the economic engine that made Walmart a giant and how one specific policy broke it. The hidden assumption at the heart of Walmart's model was the uninterrupted flow of low-cost goods through stable global supply chains. The 2025 tariffs on products from key partners, China, Mexico, and even Canada, shattered that assumption. First, let's be precise about Walmart's economic architecture. It's an ecosystem built on two pillars, immense sales volume and razor-thin profit margins. Think of the profit margin as a shock absorber. For most businesses, it provides a cushion. For Walmart, that cushion was intentionally kept almost flat, allowing them to pass savings to the customer. This model is incredibly efficient in a stable cost environment, but it's also profoundly vulnerable to sustained systemic price shocks. It simply has no capacity to absorb them. When the tariffs hit, the cost of importing goods surged. The company's leadership was transparent about the breaking point. As Walmart CEO Doug McMillon stated in a May 2025 earnings call, given the magnitude of the tariffs, we aren't able to absorb all the pressure given the reality of narrow retail margins. The result was inevitable. These costs were passed directly to consumers. An analysis from the Tax Foundation and Harvard's pricing lab confirmed the 2025 tariffs led to an average retail price increase of 6.8 to 7 percentage points. Walmart's own filings showed its general merchandise inflation jumping from 1.7% to over 3%, with its CFO attributing it directly to tariff-related costs. This wasn't an abstract number on a spreadsheet, it was the price on the shelf. The cost of cookware jumped nearly 50% in some cases, while essentials like baby products and clothing climbed steadily. This leads to the final, critical turn in the death spiral. Walmart's core value proposition has always been affordability. When that erodes its most price-sensitive customers, the very foundation of its high-volume model, buy less. As demand falls, the massive revenue required to cover the fixed costs of a supercenter evaporates. The stores and communities most dependent on that affordability become the least profitable, and they become the first to close. This isn't mismanagement, it is the logical, predictable failure of a specific business model under a specific external pressure. As Bloomberg summarized the entire 2025 retail sector, one word, tariffs. Before we look at how this is playing out on the ground, this pattern of a single dominant retailer's vulnerability becoming a community's vulnerability is a global story. Have you seen a similar dynamic in your own community? Share your observations in the comments below. We have now seen the blueprint for this collapse. The economic mechanics are clear, but a blueprint is not the building. Next, we will move from the how to the where, examining the first wave of closures and pinpointing the exact communities where this national policy first made landfall. To understand where this national policy made landfall, we first have to map the coastline's vulnerabilities. The ground, even before 2025, was already fragile. According to the USDA, nearly 14% of American households, that's almost 48 million people, were already facing food insecurity. And for years, in over 400 of the most vulnerable designated areas, a single retailer, Walmart, had become the de facto buffer. It was the primary and often only source of affordable, accessible groceries. So, what does it look like on the ground when that buffer is removed? It looks like Rapids, Minnesota in late August of 2025. This isn't a dramatic front page news event. It's a quiet unraveling. The local Walmart closes its doors and overnight 200 people are without a job. More fundamentally, the town becomes a classic food desert. For a single parent, the nearly 30-kilometer drive to the next affordable supermarket isn't an inconvenience. It's a new, permanent line item in a budget that has no room, a calculation of time and gas that simply doesn't add up. For a senior on a fixed income with limited transportation, that distance is a barrier that might as well be a brick wall. This is what it looks like when the last line of defense against food insecurity is erased. But this wasn't just a story of small rural towns. The same unraveling was happening in different forms, even in a state as wealthy as California. Take Visalia. The closure there in July 2025 affected 14,000 households. With the next full-service grocery store nearly 40 kilometers away, families were forced into what one observer called adaptation without stability. That's the technical term. The reality is the quiet, daily erosion of household resilience. It's the shift from fresh produce to canned goods. It's a reliance on neighborhood convenience stores, where the prices are higher and the nutritional value is lower. It is the slow degradation of a family's well-being, forced by a policy decision made thousands of kilometers away. These two scenes, the classic food desert in Minnesota, the forced adaptation in California, are the direct consequence of that economic blueprint we saw earlier. But to see these closures only as a food access problem is to miss the more immediate and arguably more destructive economic shockwave they send through a community. The creation of a food desert is only the first order effect. The second order effect, what happens to every other small business in town when that anchor store and its foot traffic disappear, is where the real crisis multiplies. And that impact is quantifiable, it is brutal, and it's what we must examine next. And that quantifiable impact arrived faster and with more force than anyone anticipated. We have to go to Corsicana, Texas to see the first reading on the seismograph. When the Walmart there closed in mid-2025, the effect wasn't theoretical. Within weeks, local food banks and church pantries reported a surge of more than 60% in requests for food assistance. Let's be very clear about what that number means. A 60% increase doesn't happen when a community has options. It happens when the option is removed. For a significant portion of Corsicana's residents, particularly those using SNAP benefits, that Walmart wasn't just the cheapest choice, it was the only viable one. This isn't just a story about corporate restructuring. This is a direct cost transfer, a burden taken off a corporate balance sheet in Arkansas and placed squarely onto the shoulders of local charities and, ultimately, the taxpayer. The problem wasn't solved, it was simply outsourced to the community itself. But that shockwave doesn't just hit those already in need. It's also brutally effective at creating new victims. For that, we need to look at what happened in a community of retirees, Venice, Florida. When their Walmart closed in August, it wasn't just an inconvenience. For a population living on carefully planned fixed incomes, it was a systemic attack on their financial stability. With Walmart's downward pressure on prices gone, the few remaining local stores responded. Prices on staples, bread, milk, eggs jumped by 40, sometimes 50%, almost overnight. This is the abstract concept of retail concentration made terrifyingly real. It's the moment a senior who has budgeted their life down to the dollar stands in a grocery aisle and realizes their pension has just lost half its purchasing power. It's the erasure of stability. These stories, the surge in dependency in one town and the predatory pricing in another, are the localized tremors. But the strategic threat we are now facing isn't just the creation of more food deserts. That term is no longer sufficient. we're witnessing the emergence of something far larger, something I call commercial voids. These aren't just gaps on a map where you can't buy fresh food. These are entire regions being systematically erased from the commercial landscape, becoming black holes of economic activity where almost nothing, not even basic community commerce, can easily survive. To understand what a commercial void truly means, we must look at the geographical reality of a state like New Mexico. In mid-2025, when the Walmarts in the Carlsbad and Roswell region closed their doors, residents were left staring at a blank space on the commercial map. For these communities, accessing basic necessities, not luxuries, but essentials, now requires a round trip exceeding 80 kilometers or 50 miles. This is the critical distinction. A food desert, as we've known it, describes a localized absence of affordable groceries. A commercial void is a level beyond that. It is a black hole where the pharmacy, the auto parts, the place to buy children's clothing, and the grocery store all vanish in unison. It represents the failure of an entire commercial ecosystem. This outcome in New Mexico is not an isolated incident. It is the logical endpoint of a pattern we have now traced across the country. When we connect the dots from the initial fractures in Minnesota and California to the dependency crisis in Texas and the predatory pricing in Florida, we are not observing a series of unfortunate local problems. We are observing a predictable systemic pattern of collapse. This is the quiet disaster unfolding. As one of the core analyses of this crisis stated, it is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual unraveling. The map isn't erased in a single dramatic event. It fades, one community at a time, so slowly that it barely registers as a national emergency until the voids are already deeply entrenched. But the empty storefront and the 80-kilometer drive are only the immediate visible costs. The far greater strategic threat, the one that truly tests our long-term sovereignty interest benchmark, lies in the invisible consequences that follow. The problem isn't the void itself. The real problem is the long shadow it casts over public health and public finances for decades to come. And it's in that shadow that the true, staggering cost of this policy is found. To understand that shadow, we must connect the dots in a precise sequence, beginning with a baseline fact established by rigorous research. First, we have to acknowledge the role these stores played. A major 2018 study in applied economic perspectives and policy by Kortmanch and his colleagues found that proximity to a Walmart supercenter significantly reduces food insecurity. The largest positive effects were for low-income households and for children. This isn't opinion, it's a measured, documented benefit. Therefore, the second point in the causal chain is the predictable consequence of removing that benefit. A community's access problem rapidly metastasizes into a public health crisis. The American Heart Association confirmed this in a 2021 scientific statement, directly linking food insecurity to elevated risks of cardiovascular disease and higher overall mortality rates. This isn't theoretical. A workshop summary from the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council has documented that communities within food deserts consistently show higher burdens of obesity, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. For a child growing up in one of these new commercial voids, this macro policy decision translates into a deeply personal reality. It's a pre-written medical history, a future shaped by preventable disease. Pause here. This is the connection that policymakers and news reports almost always miss. A public health crisis unfolding in slow motion is one thing, but the crucial question is, who ultimately pays the bill for it? The answer is what turns the failure of a private company into a public financial trap, because every one of those preventable chronic illnesses carries a cost that appears years later on the balance sheets of our public healthcare system. This means a decision about tariffs in 2025 isn't just about store shelves in 2026. It is about hospital admissions and healthcare budgets in 2035. The cost of a private retail closure triggered by a national industrial policy is ultimately socialized. It's paid for over decades by every taxpayer. This is the true staggering cost hidden in that long shadow. At this point, a logical question emerges. If a market of this size is left vacant, why doesn't a competitor simply move in to fill the void? The principles of supply and demand suggest one should, but they aren't. The reason reveals a deeper, systemic barrier baked into the very structure of modern retail. A barrier that the free market on its own cannot overcome. And understanding that barrier is the key to seeing why this problem won't solve itself. That systemic barrier isn't economic. It's not a failure of supply and demand, nor a lack of willing entrepreneurs. The barrier is written in law, on the very deed of the property itself, turning what should be a prime commercial location into a legally enforced dead zone. The mechanism is a legal tool known as a restrictive covenant. When a large retailer like Walmart sells one of its now empty properties, it can attach a clause to the deed. This clause explicitly forbids the new owner and any subsequent owners from using that land for a competing business. In simple terms, it's like a ghost of the old store that haunts the property, legally scaring away any new grocery stores from ever moving in. The term is restrictive covenant. It sounds like dry legal text. But this isn't some obscure loophole. It is a calculated, widespread corporate tactic. The critical point is their longevity. These legal ghosts don't haunt a property for a year or even 5. The documentation shows they are designed to lock down a community's commercial options for up to half a century. Connecting the dots here reveals the scale of this strategy. A February 2026 analysis from the Center for American Progress confirms this is a primary tool major chains use to block competition, directly contributing to the persistence of food deserts. This is not a new practice. Reporting from Business Insider, referencing data from as far back as 2010, found that Walmart alone held these deed restrictions on approximately 250 of its former, now empty store locations across the country. Let's be precise about the impact. This isn't just about preventing a direct competitor. It's about creating a permanent structural trap. When a legal restriction can last for 50 years, it outlives market cycles, demographic shifts, and entire generations of community leadership. It transforms a temporary market failure, a single store closing, into a legally enforced commercial void. The empty, decaying big box store that a community desperately needs for affordable food access cannot be used for its most obvious purpose because of a legal signature made decades ago. The free market is not failing to act. It is being legally forbidden from acting, so this is where the chain of consequences leads. Not to a temporary market failure, but to a landscape frozen by law, where recovery is legally forbidden. To fully grasp the magnitude of this, let's trace the path one last time. From the why to the what, the how, and finally the what if. The why was a national policy intended to secure industrial sovereignty, a strategic objective that paradoxically set in motion a crisis at the most granular community level. The what was the direct result. The delicate, low-margin business model of the country's largest affordable retailer was fractured. The economic bedrock for millions of households simply broke. The how was the slow, almost invisible unraveling that followed. The quiet withdrawal of stores, which became the epicenters for spreading commercial voids, and the food deserts we have mapped out. A ripple effect that silently erodes the resilience of a town. And the what if? The long-term outcome is what we just uncovered. The consequences are not temporary. They are locked in for decades by the legal ghosts of restrictive covenants and the predictable public health crises that follow in their wake. This entire sequence forces us to confront a fundamental question, one that goes far beyond any single policy or company. How does a nation balance the strategic goal of industrial sovereignty with the non-negotiable need for community-level resilience? And when those two vital objectives conflict, what is the benchmark we use to choose our path? If you believe that connecting these dots is the first step toward building genuine national strength, then share this analysis with someone who needs to understand the hidden architecture shaping our communities. and subscribe for more research that looks past the headlines to the systems underneath.